something happened during this year's NFL draft that most people completely missed. The headlines focused on where players got picked, which teams made surprising moves, and the usual draft day drama. But buried inside one rookie contract was a clause so unusual that when league executives finally noticed it, panic started spreading through front offices across the country. This wasn't about salary. It wasn't about signing bonuses or guaranteed money. This was about something the NFL has protected fiercely for decades: control. Specifically, control over how players are branded, marketed, and monetized. One family figured out how to take that control back, and now the league is scrambling to figure out what to do about it. The player at the center of this is Shedeur Sanders. And while everyone was debating whether he could play at the NFL level, his team was executing a business strategy that could reshape athlete compensation for the next generation. The numbers being reported are staggering. The implications are enormous, and the NFL's response tells you everything you need to know about how threatened they feel. This is the story of how one contract changed everything. When Shedeur Sanders heard his name called during the draft, the cameras captured exactly what you'd expect: hugs with family members, emotion on his father's face, the walk across the stage to shake hands and hold up a jersey. It looked like every other draft moment we've seen 1,000 times before. The sports media ran their usual stories. They talked about his arm talent, his college statistics, his famous father, and what his presence might mean for the team that selected him. Analysts debated whether he could compete for a starting job or if he'd need time to develop. Social media exploded with takes from every possible angle. The entire conversation centered on football. Nobody was talking about contract language. Nobody was examining the fine print. And that's exactly how the Sanders family wanted it. To understand why this contract was so different, you first need to understand how NFL rookie deals typically work. The league operates under a collective bargaining agreement that essentially removes negotiation from the equation for new players. When you get drafted, your compensation is largely predetermined. The slot you're picked in determines your signing bonus. Your base salary follows a formula. There's very little room to get creative. This system exists for a reason. The NFL learned from past mistakes when rookie contracts spiraled out of control, with unproven players demanding massive guaranteed money before ever taking a professional snap. The current structure protects teams from overpaying and creates predictability across the league. Every fifth-round pick signs essentially the same deal as every other fifth-round pick. It's standardized, it's boring, and it's been working exactly as the league designed it for years. So when Shedeur's contract hit the system, nothing appeared out of the ordinary at first glance. The base numbers matched what everyone expected for his draft position. The signing bonus aligned with the slot value. On paper, this looked identical to dozens of other rookie deals signed during the same week. But contracts are about more than salary figures. They contain provisions, clauses, amendments, and language that can fundamentally alter the relationship between player and team. Most rookies sign whatever's put in front of them because they don't have leverage to demand changes. They're just happy to make the roster. Their agents negotiate around the margins, maybe getting some minor bonuses or incentives, but the core structure stays intact. Shedeur's situation was different from the very beginning. He didn't arrive as a typical rookie hoping to prove himself worthy of attention. He arrived as an established brand with millions of followers, existing business relationships, and a family legacy that understood exactly how the sports business machine operates. He had leverage that most rookies can only dream about, and his team knew exactly how to use it. The specific language that made his contract unusual related to something called brand equity provisions. In standard NFL contracts, the league and team maintain significant control over how a player's name, image, and likeness gets used for commercial purposes. When you buy a jersey with a player's name on it, the revenue flows through NFL licensing systems. When a highlight gets used in promotional material, the league controls that footage. When merchandise gets created, players receive a small collective share rather than individual compensation tied to their specific popularity. This system means that a player who sells millions of jerseys might receive roughly the same merchandise-related compensation as a player who barely sells any. The NFL pools this revenue and distributes it according to collective bargaining formulas. Individual marketability doesn't translate to individual reward. The league maintains centralized control, and players accept this as the cost of being in the NFL. Reports suggest that Shedeur's contract approached this differently. Instead of accepting the standard language about commercial rights, his team negotiated provisions that allowed him to retain control over aspects of his personal brand. The exact details remain somewhat unclear because contract specifics aren't always made public. But industry sources indicate that the structure was unusual enough to raise eyebrows among people who review these documents regularly. What seemed like a normal transaction on the surface was actually the result of careful planning that started years before draft day. Every interview Shedeur gave during his college years, every social media post, every content piece his team created was building toward this moment. They weren't just developing a football player. They were developing a business that would eventually need to negotiate its relationship with the NFL from a position of strength. The media missed this entirely. They were focused on arm angles and footwork and whether Shedeur could handle the pressure of the professional game. Meanwhile, his family was executing a strategy that had very little to do with what happened between the lines on Sunday. But the surface story never tells you what's really happening. The real story was about money, power, and who gets to control the most valuable asset in professional sports, the players themselves. And what was happening behind the scenes would eventually send shockwaves through every front office in the league. You can't understand what Shedeur accomplished in his contract negotiations without going back to Colorado. That's where the blueprint was created. That's where the Sanders family proved that their approach to athlete branding wasn't just theory. It actually worked. When Deion Sanders took over the Colorado football program, everyone expected changes on the field. What they didn't expect was a complete transformation of how a college program could function in the modern media landscape. Within months, Colorado went from an afterthought to the most talked about team in college football. And Shedeur was at the center of everything. The attention wasn't accidental. It was manufactured through a sophisticated content strategy that treated every practice, every game, and every moment as an opportunity to build audience connection. Camera crews followed the team constantly. Behind the scenes, footage flooded social media. The Sanders family understood that in today's world, access creates loyalty, and loyalty creates value. Shedeur's social media presence exploded during this period. His Instagram followers multiplied. His content reached audiences who had never watched college football before. He wasn't just a quarterback at a struggling program. He was becoming a cultural figure whose appeal extended far beyond sports fans. This matters because the college athletics landscape had just changed dramatically. The NIL era, which allowed college athletes to monetize their name, image, and likeness for the first time, created opportunities that previous generations couldn't access. Most athletes used this new freedom to sign some endorsement deals and make extra money during their college years. The Sanders family saw something bigger. They treated NIL not as a temporary money-making opportunity, but as a foundation for something permanent. Every brand partnership Shedeur signed was evaluated based on how it contributed to his long-term positioning. Every content piece was designed to build an audience that would follow him beyond college. The goal was never just to maximize college earnings. The goal was to arrive at the NFL with so much independent value that the league would have to negotiate differently. While other top prospects were focused primarily on their football development, Shedeur was receiving an education in business that few athletes ever experience. His father had walked this path before, building media relationships and business ventures during his own playing career. Now, he was transferring that knowledge directly to his son, making sure Shedeur understood that athletic ability was just one part of the equation. The content machine that Colorado became served multiple purposes. It kept the program in the national conversation, which helped with recruiting. It generated revenue through various partnerships and media deals. And most importantly for Shedeur personally, it proved that the Sanders brand could drive engagement at levels comparable to established professional organizations. By the time draft season arrived, Shedeur had something that most rookies simply don't have: proof. He could demonstrate, with actual numbers, that his personal brand drove measurable business results. His social media engagement rates exceeded many NFL players. His content generated views that rivaled official league productions. Brands were already paying significant money to be associated with him. This proof changed the negotiating dynamic completely. When his representatives sat down to discuss contract terms, they weren't making speculative arguments about potential value. They were presenting evidence of existing value, and that evidence was difficult to dismiss. The traditional NFL approach assumes that the league creates star power. Players arrive as relatively unknown quantities, and the platform of professional football elevates them to fame and fortune. The team and league deserve credit for this elevation, which justifies their control over commercial rights. This logic has dominated contract negotiations for decades. Shedeur's Colorado years flipped this logic entirely. He could credibly argue that he wasn't arriving as an unknown needing the NFL's platform to become relevant. He was arriving as an established entity that would bring its own audience to whatever team drafted him. The value flow wasn't purely from league to player. It was bidirectional and maybe even tilted in his favor. This distinction matters enormously when negotiating commercial provisions. If the NFL is creating your star power, it makes sense for them to control how that star power gets monetized. But if you're arriving with your own star power, the argument for league control becomes much weaker. The Colorado years also demonstrated something else crucial. Audience loyalty could be maintained across transitions. When Shedeur left Jackson State for Colorado alongside his father, his followers came with him. They weren't fans of a specific program. They were fans of the Sanders brand itself. This suggested that NFL team identity might matter less than personal brand identity for someone in Shedeur's position. Every major business decision made during those college years was pointing toward the eventual NFL negotiation. The content strategy, the brand partnerships, the audience development, the public persona cultivation. It all connected to the moment when Shedeur's representatives would sit across from NFL executives and explain why the standard contract language wouldn't work for this particular player. Most rookies have nothing but potential to negotiate with. Shedeur had a track record, a business operation, and a family that understood exactly how to translate those assets into contractual advantages. The blueprint had been drawn. Now it was time to execute. Deion Sanders didn't just teach his son how to play football. He taught him how to survive and thrive in a business that has historically taken advantage of athletes who don't understand its mechanics. Those lessons started early and continued throughout Shedeur's development into a professional prospect. To understand the philosophy behind Shedeur's contract approach, you need to understand what Deion experienced during his own playing career. He entered the NFL in 1989, during an era when player marketing was far more limited than today. There was no social media, no direct access to fans, no ability to build independent brands outside of team and league structures. Athletes were almost entirely dependent on the organizations that employed them. Even within those constraints, Deion found ways to maximize his value. He became one of the most marketable players of his generation, landing endorsement deals and media opportunities that extended beyond traditional sports sponsorships. He understood intuitively that personality and entertainment value could generate returns that pure athletic performance couldn't match. But he also watched countless teammates and peers get exploited by a system designed to extract maximum value while returning minimum compensation. He saw players generate billions in revenue for leagues and owners while ending their careers with little financial security. He witnessed how quickly organizations discarded athletes once their physical abilities declined, regardless of what those athletes had contributed during their productive years. These observations shaped his worldview about player-team relationships. He came to believe that athletes needed to think of themselves as businesses first and employees second. Your team gives you a salary, but your value extends far beyond what they're paying you. If you don't capture that additional value yourself, the system will capture it and keep it. Deion has spoken publicly about these beliefs many times. He's called out what he sees as unfair compensation structures. He's encouraged players to understand their worth and negotiate accordingly. He's positioned himself as an advocate for athlete empowerment in a world where the power balance traditionally favors management. When his sons began developing as serious athletic prospects, Deion made sure they received an education in business alongside their sports training. This wasn't the typical advice about saving money and avoiding bad investments. This was sophisticated instruction about brand building, audience development, intellectual property, and negotiation strategy. Shedeur grew up understanding concepts that most athletes don't encounter until they're already locked into contracts that limit their options. He knew about licensing and merchandising before he signed his first nil deal. He understood the difference between short-term earnings and long-term brand equity before he was old enough to vote. He learned to evaluate every opportunity based on how it contributed to his overall strategic position. This education accelerated as Shedeur's NFL prospects became clearer. Dayan brought in advisors and experts to discuss specific aspects of the professional sports business. They analyzed how other athletes had succeeded or failed in building post-playing career enterprises. They studied the contract structures that had given certain players unusual advantages and the ones that had trapped players in unfavorable situations. By the time Shedeur was seriously preparing for the draft, he understood the NFL's business model better than many people who work in league front offices. He knew exactly where the money came from and where it went. He understood which revenue streams players typically accessed and which ones remained controlled by ownership and league structures. This knowledge informed every aspect of his draft preparation. While other prospects focused almost exclusively on their athletic evaluation, Shedeur's team was preparing a comprehensive business case for why his contract should look different from everyone else's. They were developing language and provisions that could survive legal scrutiny while still achieving their goals of retained brand control. Dayan's influence extended beyond strategy into mindset. He taught Shedeur to approach negotiations without the gratitude that often handicaps young athletes. Many rookies feel lucky just to be in the NFL and are reluctant to make demands that might seem aggressive or ungrateful. They accept standard terms because they don't want to create conflict before their careers even begin. Dayan made sure Shedeur understood that this attitude, while understandable, often costs athletes significant money over the course of their careers. The NFL is a business, and businesses negotiate aggressively to protect their interests. Athletes should do the same without apology. He also emphasized the importance of thinking beyond football. Playing careers are short. Even the most successful athletes are typically finished in their 30s. What happens after that determines whether all those years of physical sacrifice result in lasting security or just memories. The goal was never just to get Shedeur a good NFL contract. The goal was to position him for a lifetime of opportunity, using the NFL platform to build something permanent rather than simply collecting paychecks until his body gave out. Everything that happened in those contract negotiations reflected this generational transfer of knowledge. Dayan had spent decades learning how the sports business really works. Now his son was applying those lessons in ways that could change the industry. The student was about to surpass the teacher in at least one respect. He was about to do something no NFL player had done before. The details of what made Shedeur's contract unusual didn't leak immediately. Rookie contracts typically don't generate much analysis because they're so standardized. Sports reporters focus on the football implications of draft picks, not the legal language of their agreements. For the first few weeks after signing, nothing about Shedeur's deal attracted special attention. That changed when people started looking closer. According to reports that emerged from league sources, Shedeur's contract contained provisions that departed significantly from standard rookie templates. The core structure, the base salary and signing bonus determined by draft position, remained compliant with CBA requirements. But additional language addressed the commercial relationship between player and team in ways that hadn't been seen before. The most significant reported provision related to what industry insiders began calling brand equity rights. In traditional NFL contracts, teams and the league maintain substantial control over how a player's identity gets used for commercial purposes. Jersey sales, merchandise, media appearances, promotional content. All of this flows through centralized systems where the league takes its cut and players receive collective distributions rather than individual compensation tied to their specific popularity. Reports suggest that Shedeur's contract carved out exceptions to this standard approach. Rather than ceding control over his brand to the team and league, he allegedly retained rights that would allow him to benefit directly from his own marketability. The exact percentage structures and specific terms remain somewhat unclear, but the general principle was radical for the NFL context. If accurate, this meant that when someone bought a Shedeur Sanders jersey, he would receive compensation beyond the standard collective pool distribution. When brands wanted to use his image or associate with him commercially, he could negotiate those deals independently rather than going through league-controlled channels. When content featuring him generated revenue, he would have claimed to a portion of that revenue based on his individual contribution rather than a generic team or league payment. This structure exists in other contexts. Entertainers typically maintain significant control over their image rights. Some international soccer stars have negotiated similar provisions. But in the NFL, where the league has historically maintained exceptionally tight control over player commercial rights, this reportedly represented new territory. The framing matters here. These details emerged through industry reporting and source conversations rather than official contract disclosures. The specific numbers that circulated, including claims about direct payments in the tens of millions, should be understood as reported figures rather than confirmed facts. What's clear is that something about this contract was unusual enough to generate significant discussion among people who review these documents professionally. The mechanics of how such provisions would actually work in practice involve considerable complexity. The NFL's merchandising operations flow through NFLPA licensing agreements and league-controlled retail channels. Carving out individual exceptions to these systems requires navigating significant legal and operational hurdles. The fact that Shedeur's team apparently succeeded in negotiating such exceptions speaks to both their legal sophistication and the leverage they brought to the table. That leverage came from everything built during the previous years: the Colorado content machine, the massive social media following, the existing brand partnerships, the demonstrated ability to drive commercial results independent of NFL structures. When negotiating, Shedeur's representatives could credibly argue that his situation was fundamentally different from other rookies and therefore deserved different treatment. Most rookies have nothing but promise. They need the NFL platform to become valuable. Shedeur arrived with proven value that existed regardless of what the league did. This changed the negotiation dynamic in ways that most players simply cannot replicate. The contract language reportedly included provisions for various scenarios that could arise during his career: how brand rights would be handled if he was traded, what happened to merchandise agreements if he became a star versus if he remained a backup, how conflicts between personal brand deals and team obligations would be resolved. The sophistication of these provisions suggested extensive legal preparation and anticipation of potential complications. Teams typically resist any contract language that departs from their standard templates. Novel provisions create uncertainty and potential conflicts. They require legal review and executive approval. Most of the time, it's simply easier to tell rookies to sign the standard deal and move on. For Shedeur's team to successfully negotiate these unusual terms, they needed to overcome significant institutional resistance. This required both leverage and persistence. Leverage came from Shedeur's unique market position. Persistence came from a family that had been planning for this moment for years and wasn't about to accept standard terms that would surrender their carefully built advantages. The end result was reportedly a contract that looked normal on the surface, but contained provisions that could fundamentally alter the financial relationship between this particular player and the NFL ecosystem. Those provisions were about to generate consequences that extended far beyond one player's bank account. When league executives finally understood what had been agreed to, the reaction was immediate and intense. They recognized that this wasn't just about Shedeur Sanders. This was about precedent. This was about what every agent and every prospect would now know was possible. And once that knowledge spread, there would be no going back. The financial implications of Shedeur's contract structure became clearer as his first professional season unfolded. And the numbers being reported were staggering enough to explain why the league was so concerned about precedent. NFL merchandise is a multi-billion-dollar industry. Jersey sales alone generate enormous revenue annually, with popular players driving significant portions of that total. Under the traditional system, this money flows through NFLPA licensing agreements and gets distributed according to formulas that don't necessarily reward individual popularity. A player who sells millions of jerseys might receive only marginally more than a player who barely sells any. This collective approach has justifications. It creates solidarity among players and ensures that offensive linemen and special teams contributors receive some merchandise revenue even though fans aren't rushing to buy their jerseys. But it also means that individually marketable players subsidize the rest of the league rather than capturing the full value of their personal popularity. Under the structure reportedly built into Shedeur's contract, at least some portion of his merchandise value would flow directly to him rather than through collective pools. If accurate, this means that when his jersey became one of the best-selling items in NFL retail, he benefited personally in ways that other players in similar situations historically have not. Reports suggested that the direct financial benefits from brand equity provisions reached significant figures within his first year. While specific numbers should be treated with appropriate skepticism given the sourcing, claims of direct payments in the range of several $million circulated among industry observers. Some reports went considerably higher, suggesting total brand-related revenue approaching figures that would dwarf his actual playing salary. To put this in perspective, fifth-round picks typically earn base salaries well under $1 million in their first year. If Shedeur was actually receiving several million or more from brand equity provisions on top of his playing contract, his total compensation package would rival players drafted in the first round or higher. The draft position that normally determines rookie earnings would become almost irrelevant compared to the value generated by his personal brand. This inversion of the typical compensation structure is exactly what makes the precedent so threatening to league interests. The NFL's rookie wage scale exists specifically to prevent compensation from getting out of control for unproven players. If personal brand equity can circumvent that scale, the entire system becomes less meaningful. The revenue streams reportedly flowing to Shedeur came from multiple sources. Merchandise sales were the most obvious and easily understood component. When fans purchased jerseys, shirts, hats, and other items featuring his name or likeness, the equity provisions allegedly ensured he received direct benefit rather than just collective pool participation. But merchandise was just the beginning. In the modern media landscape, content generates significant revenue. Highlight clips that go viral, behind-the-scenes footage, interview appearances, documentary features. All of this content has commercial value. Under traditional arrangements, the league and team control this content and capture its value. Under Shedeur's reported provisions, at least some of that value remained with him. His existing social media infrastructure amplified these effects. When he posted content on his own channels, he controlled the monetization entirely. When that content drove engagement and attracted brand partnerships, the revenue came directly to his business operations rather than flowing through NFL systems. The audience he had built during college continued generating value at the professional level. Brand partnerships represented another significant revenue category. Companies wanting to associate with Shedeur could potentially work with him directly rather than going through league-controlled sponsorship channels. This meant negotiating terms favorable to his interests rather than accepting the standardized arrangements that the NFL brokers for player appearances and endorsements. The cumulative effect of all these streams reportedly created a compensation picture that looked nothing like what people expected for a fifth-round quarterback. While his teammates earned their contracted salaries and waited to prove themselves worthy of bigger deals, Shedeur was allegedly generating wealth that made his draft position almost meaningless financially. This was precisely the outcome that his family had spent years engineering. All those Colorado content pieces, all those social media followers, all those brand relationships built during college, they converted into professional-level revenue immediately rather than waiting for on-field performance to create opportunities. The financial success also validated the broader philosophy that Dayan had taught his son. By owning the brand rather than leasing it to the league, Shedeur captured value that would normally disappear into NFL corporate structures. He demonstrated that the alternative approach wasn't just theoretically sound. It actually worked. As word of these results spread through agent networks and player communities, the implications became clear. Other athletes would want the same thing. Future prospects would arrive at negotiations with Shedeur's contract as a reference point. The Sanders precedent would become a bargaining chip for countless players who had never previously imagined they could challenge the NFL's control over their commercial identities. The money was real. The model was proven. And the league knew that containing this situation was going to be extremely difficult. The question was no longer whether other players would try to replicate Shedeur's approach. The question was how many would succeed. The NFL's reaction to Shedeur's contract situation revealed just how threatening league executives found this precedent. While public statements remained measured, the activity behind the scenes suggested genuine alarm about where this could lead. Initial responses focused on understanding what had actually happened. Front office personnel across multiple teams reportedly sought copies of the contract language to analyze exactly what provisions had been agreed to. Legal departments tried to determine whether the terms complied with CBA requirements or exploited ambiguities that could be closed in future negotiations. The answers weren't comforting for those who wanted to dismiss this as a one-time anomaly. Nothing about Shedeur's contract apparently violated collective bargaining agreement terms. The provisions addressed commercial rights areas where CBA language left room for individual negotiation. The team that signed him had agreed to the terms, presumably after their own legal review. There was no obvious mechanism to invalidate what had been done. This created a difficult strategic situation for the league. They couldn't simply void the contract on technical grounds. They couldn't publicly attack a player for successfully negotiating favorable terms. They couldn't appear to be suppressing athlete rights in an era when player empowerment has significant public support. What they could do was work to prevent replication, and reports suggest that's exactly what began happening. Communications from league offices to teams reportedly emphasized the importance of maintaining standard contract language with future draft picks. Teams were encouraged to resist unusual provisions and reminded of the collective benefits that come from unified approaches to player contracts. The message was clear without being explicit: don't let this happen again. Agent networks reported increased resistance when attempting to negotiate Sanders-style provisions for their own clients. Teams that might have been flexible on commercial rights language became notably more rigid. The informal pressure to maintain standards intensified across the league. At the NFLPA level, the situation created complex dynamics. The union's fundamental purpose is advocating for player interests, and Shedeur's contract represented exactly the kind of value capture that players have long sought. At the same time, the collective approach to licensing and revenue sharing serves important functions for player solidarity and ensures that less marketable players still benefit from the league's overall commercial success. Some within the union reportedly viewed the Sanders precedent as a potential template for future collective bargaining demands. If one player could negotiate individual brand equity provisions, perhaps similar provisions could be demanded for all players in the next CBA negotiation. This would represent a fundamental shift in how player compensation works, moving away from pure salary toward more comprehensive value sharing. Others worried about fragmentation. If individual players can negotiate separate commercial arrangements, the collective leverage that comes from unified action could weaken. The NFL might find ways to play players against each other, offering better individual terms to some while giving others nothing. Solidarity has historically been the union's greatest strength, and anything that undermines it deserves careful consideration. These internal debates within the NFLPA reflected the genuine complexity of what Shedeur's contract represented. It wasn't simply good or bad for players as a group. It was a new model with unpredictable implications that could cut different ways depending on how things developed. League ownership circles reportedly discussed the situation at various organizational meetings. While public agendas focused on typical business matters, informal conversations addressed the threat that player brand independence posed to traditional revenue structures. Some owners apparently expressed significant concern about losing control over commercial assets they had long considered safely within league authority. The challenge for ownership was that market forces would be difficult to resist. If players with significant independent brands could generate more value through Sanders-style provisions, agents would naturally pursue those provisions. Teams wanting to sign popular players might have to offer unusual terms to complete deals. Competitive pressure could erode unified resistance even if owners philosophically opposed the trend. Some suggested that future CBA negotiations should specifically address and limit individual commercial provisions. By writing clear restrictions into the collective agreement, the league could close the door that Shedeur had opened. But this would require union agreement, and it seemed unlikely that the NFLPA would voluntarily surrender gains that one of its members had already achieved. Others proposed different approaches. Perhaps the league should embrace player branding and find ways to participate in the value rather than fighting it entirely. Partnerships between league commercial operations and individual player brands could capture some of the growth while reducing conflict. This view represented a more pragmatic acceptance that the world was changing whether the NFL liked it or not. What became clear from all these responses was that the league was taking the situation seriously. This wasn't being dismissed as a quirky exception that would fade from relevance. Executives understood that precedent matters enormously in labor relations. What one player achieves creates expectations for others, and once expectations change, they're very difficult to reset. The scramble to contain the Sanders precedent had begun. Whether it would succeed remained to be seen. But already, the next generation of prospects was paying attention. The impact of Shedeur's contract extended far beyond his own financial situation. Within months of the details becoming known, ripples were spreading throughout professional sports in ways that suggested permanent changes were underway. Among current NFL players, the reaction mixed admiration with frustration. Veterans who had signed standard contracts throughout their careers recognized that Shedeur was capturing value they had always surrendered without realizing alternatives existed. Wide receivers who had sold hundreds of thousands of jerseys suddenly understood that most of that revenue had never reached them. Defensive players with massive social media followings realized their content was generating value they weren't receiving. These realizations created immediate conversations with agents. Players wanted to know whether their existing contracts could be renegotiated. They wanted to understand what provisions might be possible in future extensions or free agency deals. They wanted their representatives to study the Sanders approach and identify applicable lessons. Agents found themselves in an interesting position. The Sanders precedent gave them new ammunition for negotiations, but replicating it would be challenging. Shedeur's leverage came from unique circumstances. His established brand, his family's expertise, his willingness to push against norms. Most players didn't have those advantages. Still, even partial success in negotiating brand equity provisions would represent progress compared to the previous status quo. The college prospects preparing for future drafts paid particularly close attention. They understood that the nil era had given them opportunities to build brands before going professional. Now they saw that those brands could translate into contractual advantages at the next level. The Sanders approach became a model that serious prospects began studying and planning to replicate. Agents representing top college talent reportedly began incorporating brand development into their pre-draft strategies. Rather than focusing purely on athletic evaluation and interview preparation, they started treating their clients as businesses that needed to arrive at the NFL with negotiating leverage. Social media presence, content creation, sponsorship relationships, and audience building all became more important parts of the process. This shift in priorities had implications for how college athletes spent their time and energy. If building a personal brand could be worth millions in contract negotiations, the incentives to invest in that brand became much stronger. Some worried that this might distract from athletic development. Others argued that learning to manage a business would benefit athletes throughout their careers, regardless of specific contract outcomes. The ripple effect extended beyond individual athletes to the broader infrastructure of professional sports. Agencies began hiring specialists in brand development and digital marketing. Law firms started promoting expertise in athlete commercial rights. New businesses emerged to help athletes build the kind of independent value that could support Sanders-style negotiations. Media coverage of athletes evolved as well. Stories about brand building and business strategy became more common alongside traditional performance analysis. The public developed greater awareness of the commercial dimensions of professional sports and the historically unequal distribution of value between athletes and organizations. Other professional leagues watched the NFL situation with interest. The NBA had already moved further toward player empowerment in various ways. Soccer leagues worldwide dealt with similar dynamics around superstar brands. But the NFL's size and influence meant that changes there could reshape expectations across all of sports. Some observers suggested that athlete unions across different sports would coordinate their approaches in future negotiations. If NFL players could establish precedents for individual brand equity provisions, those precedents could inform demands in other leagues. The collective bargaining dynamics of professional sports might shift in synchronized ways across multiple organizations. Within locker rooms, Shedeur reportedly became a source of information for curious teammates. Rather than hoarding his knowledge, he apparently shared insights about brand building and business strategy with players who asked. This knowledge transfer accelerated the spread of new thinking about athlete commercial rights and empowerment. Coaches and team management found themselves navigating unfamiliar dynamics. Traditional team hierarchy assumed that players depended on organizational resources for their success and visibility. When players arrived with independent platforms and commercial operations, that dependency relationship weakened. Managing athletes who thought of themselves as business partners rather than employees required different approaches. The cultural shift was perhaps more significant than any specific contractual provision. Shedeur represented a new kind of professional athlete, one who arrived fully formed as a business entity rather than developing commercial value gradually through team and league exposure. If this became the norm, the relationship between athletes and organizations would fundamentally transform. Whether established leagues would adapt to this transformation or resist it remained an open question, but the direction of change seemed clear. Athletes were gaining power, organizations were losing control, and the trends accelerating this shift showed no signs of reversing. The ripple effect was just beginning. The full consequences would take years to fully manifest, but already, the sports industry would never be the same. What Shedeur Sanders accomplished goes far beyond one contract or one player's bank account. He demonstrated that the old rules of professional sports don't have to be permanent. That athletes with enough preparation, leverage, and willingness to challenge norms can reshape the terms of their relationship with leagues and teams. Whether he becomes an NFL star or not, this precedent will outlast his playing career. Future players will reference his contract in negotiations. Agents will use his success as ammunition. The collective bargaining discussions of coming years will grapple with questions his deal raised. The NFL built its empire on controlling player identities and capturing commercial value that athletes create. One family spent years preparing to challenge that system, and they succeeded in ways that have league executives genuinely worried. This story is just beginning. The ripple effects will continue spreading through front offices, locker rooms, and negotiating tables for years to come. The sports industry is transforming, and the Sanders precedent will be remembered as a turning point. Pay attention to what happens next. The future of athlete empowerment is being written right now, and everyone in professional sports is watching.